So Yom HaZikaron, which is translated into Memorial Day, is, to my mind, something that we take for granted, whether it's in the United States, or we commemorate the fallen soldiers that fought for our freedom and for us to be able to live in this great country, and Kal V'chomer in Eretz Yisrael, where we feel a certain distance of thousands of miles away. We kind of take for granted, you know, when we go there, we enjoy everything in Eretz Yisrael, whether it's enjoying the country or hopefully going to learn there, and don't really focus on the sacrifices that really help build the country. When I go to Eretz Yisrael to visit the guys every year, I oftentimes go to a cemetery. Rabbi Elek may or may not have known that, and this past year I took some pictures of some of the grave sites, which my wife is emailing me as we speak, and it's really tragic to see. This is from 1948. This guy came from Romania. He died at the age of 21. This guy came from Bulgaria. This guy came from Turkey. This guy came from Iraq, and all had their lives snuffed out at relatively young ages. And these were the, you know, guys that gave their lives to really help establish what we have today in Eretz Yisrael. I think, sadly, it's a type of thing that if someone was really, really sick, you know, you can't wait to get to the doctor's office, and you're there early, and you're just waiting for the doctor to come, and then 3, 4, 5, 6 years later, after you're healthy, and you have to go for a doctor's appointment, maybe you'll even come late, and the doctor's going to be waiting for you. That's kind of the way human psychology works, and it's sad. Meaning to say, no one would question the sacrifices and the pain we would all feel if we were there in 1948, or in 67, or 56, or during the Lebanon War, when the whole nation, right, is united in the quest, really, to stay alive. And who's keeping us alive? Well, the IDF, Tzahal. So when you're B'shas mice at the time, you're all there. But as time passes on, you know, you kind of take for granted the sacrifices there. You maybe feel a little bad about it, and you don't really realize the full impact of it. I got an email from a dear friend of myself and Rabbi Har last night, a fellow Doug Mandel. Was very close to his neighbor that made Aliyah. His neighbor was a Rav previously, and his wife, I believe, was a social worker. And their son, 21-year-old boy, Ari, was learning yeshiva. You know, unfortunately was killed during one of the wars. And the mother says, this is a pain that, you know, he's with me every day. I long for my son, and it's a tragic thing that she has to live with every day in their family. She said, Abiyas Gavol Tzedek. So this is not something we should just take lightly. It's not something we should just, okay, we have an assembly today, we're talking about it. It's something we should really feel the pain of and internalize and recognize really the tremendous sacrifices that continuously go on, not just by the people that gave their lives. And it doesn't matter religious or not religious, these are Jews. This is defending other Jews and Medinat Yisrael and Klal Yisrael, but the sacrifices they continue to make today.
I'm going to start by just reading the email I sent out to all the parents last night. I don't know how many of you saw it. 70 years ago, the Magen David was a yellow star that our tormentors forced our nation to wear as a sign of shame and humiliation, and as a mark of a nation marked for annihilation. Very few, if any, Jews dared to dream that in the near future a sovereign Jewish state would come into existence after close to 2,000 years of diaspora. Certainly not so close after the horrors of the Shoah. Yet the Almighty deemed that precisely in the period after the Shoah, the Jewish nation will have its prayers answered, and many of the words of the Nevi'im would finally come true. On Hei Iyar, Tafshin Chet, David Ben-Gurion read Megillat HaAtzmaut, and every Jew in Israel was listening on the radio, many of them weeping with joy. When he was done, Rav Yehuda Leib Maimon, also known as Rav Fishman, got up and in a tearful voice recited the Shechianu, after which all the people in the room said a tearful Amen. Imagine how Holocaust survivors felt that day. The Magen David had morphed from a yellow sign of shame into the proud blue and white flag of a sovereign Jewish state. Truly a miracle of epic proportions. It was a watershed event that has profoundly changed the fortunes of the Jewish nation, both in the state of Israel as well as the entire diaspora. Imagine if, God forbid, there was no re-established Jewish state, and the last Jewish event of historical significance was the liberation of the Jews of Europe from concentration camps and Nazi barbarism. I shudder to think what Jewish life in the world would look like today. We have so much to be thankful to the Creator for. But alas, the gift of Jewish sovereignty, much like the first Jewish state Yehoshua ben Nun established, or the second sovereign Jewish state that the Maccabees established, has been paved with the sacrifices of Jewish soldiers and the victims of Arab and Islamic terror. Freedom is not free. We at Rambam Mesivta will be spending the next 2 days running a series of programs in Shiurim that all have the goal of having your son sense to feel the pain of Yom HaZikaron and the happiness and thankfulness of Yom HaAtzmaut. So I'm going to attempt to continue what Rabbi Friedman said and give you a sense of this. Let me tell you why Yom HaZikaron came to be. Why they picked this day. The day before the state of Israel was established, there was one last heroic battle that took place in Gush Etzion. Gush Etzion is where the yeshiva is, where the Levaya was yesterday. In those days, was a collection of 4 Jewish towns. And in essence, without going into all the history, those in my class know the history, from November 29, 1947, until May 14, 1948, when the British left, there was a civil war between the undergrounds of the Jews, the Haganah, Palmach, Etz, Alechi, against all the terror groups run by the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, and all his friends from Jordan and Syria and Iraq, Neminayim. And the war was a vicious war for control of the roads. Both sides didn't have an air force, the British are still there. Whoever controls the roads controls the country. So the main battle was for the Tel Aviv-Jerusalem road. They understood very well that for religious reasons and historical reasons, if you cut Jerusalem out, we won't have the otzma, we won't have the will to declare a Jewish state. Gush Etzion was south of Yerushalayim, it's about 10 miles south. They had been fighting there since January of 48. At first they were holding their own, fighting back waves of Arabs, but by March it became clear that this was a fruitless battle in terms of keeping Gush Etzion Jewish. And it now took on another role. The role was to act as a lightning rod, to attract the enemy. All the women were evacuated, children were evacuated, elderly were evacuated, volunteers stayed. About 250 men volunteered to stay. And their goal was one goal, to attract as many Arab forces to fight against them. Because by doing that, it's less Arab forces that could fight against Yerushalayim. So fathers kiss their sons and babies and children goodbye. Most of the people today who are in their early 60s or 70s are the children who were left in 1948 by their fathers. They kiss their wives goodbye, and they realize they're making their last stand in Gush Etzion. And they did it for Yerushalayim. If it's for Yerushalayim, then it's for all of Tzion. The overwhelming majority of these were religious fighters. Of the 4 Yeshuvim, 3 religious, 1 was not. It doesn't make a difference, as Rabbi Friedman said, just for historical knowledge. They held out until Daled Iyar. They held out. These 250 attracted 5,000 Arab terrorist fighters. And finally, their lines broke, and they were massacred. A handful were taken as prisoner by the Jordanian Arab Legion, which had British officers. So they acted as human beings. The rest were butchered. Everybody in Yerushalayim and everybody in what was going to be the state of Israel the next day, Erev Shabbat, knew that they owe their existence after 1900 years of Galut to the fighters of Kfar Etzion. It took a while till they collected the bodies. The one who became famous as the first Rav to go and start doing this was Rav Goren. He showed up with a team and they mamish collected all the bodies. When they eventually came to Yerushalayim, the entire city came out to the Levaya. There wasn't a person who didn't come out. It didn't make a difference what size the yarmulke was, if you wore a shtreimel, a hat, a kippah, or gilui rosh. Everybody came out and knew these people were kedoshim. And it's in their schut, Yerushalayim was saved. And in the schut of having Yerushalayim, we declared a sovereign Jewish state. And that's where Yom HaZikaron comes from. Because they fell on Daled Diyar. As it says in the Tanakh, B'damai chai. And that's the story of why this day was picked. Now, as it works out historically, from Yom HaShoah until Yom HaAtzmaut, there's become a term now that you hear in Israel, just like we have Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, Lahavdil, a lot of people call it Aseret Yemei HaTkuma. The 10 days where we begin to rise. Starting with Yom HaShoah, which was the low point since Churban Bayit Sheni. I think everybody who knows Jewish history knows. Beryl Wine even made this point, that really after Churban Bayit Sheni, even with all the horror, there's nothing like the Shoah. There's nothing as devastating as the Shoah to the Jewish nation since Churban Bayit Sheni. So that happened and ended 3 years before Israel was reestablished. In history, 3 years is a blink of an eye. The day before Yom HaAtzmaut is Yom HaZikaron. So always we should remember this transfer from Shoah to Tkuma. From Mamish being, like we say in Hallel, Me'ashpot Yarim Evyon. We were literally down in the garbage, in the dumps. And as I said before, Chalila B'chas, there was not a reestablished Jewish state. I have no doubt, and there are very few things in this world I am sure of, that the world Jewish life that we have today wouldn't exist on any level if there was not a reestablished Jewish state. If the last event was the liberation of Auschwitz, Dachau, Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen, I shudder to think what world Jewry would look like today. Probably more like Marano's than anything else. That would be my guess. So what is this day in Israel? I want to give you a tom. On a personal note, and then I'll talk with people who have more, about people who unfortunately have much more to think about than I do. It's, number one, I carry in my wallet two things that always remind me of Yom HaZikaron. When I showed up in 2001 to participate in what we call the Oslo War, I found out, I came because 3 civilians had been killed and terrorized. And one of them was the mother of one of my students from Flatbush, the Zecher Nishmata. I dedicated my service when I went that summer. And when I got there, the guy who ended up being my commander, who's now a very close friend of mine, told me his neighbor had been killed a few weeks before I got there by a sniper in the tunnels from Yerushalayim to Gush Etzion. And his name was Tzachi. And he wrote this whole letter, what it was like to be a religious soldier. And he explains, we have to get up early, we have to daven earlier. Sometimes people don't understand what we're doing. It's a really nice piece that he wrote, what it's like to be a religious soldier in the army. And in the back is Tfilat HaDerech. So I've been carrying this with me since the week I showed up to do Miluim in July 2001. Secondly, I met Miriam Peretz 4 years ago. Miriam Peretz is a woman that spoke in this building. She has the unfortunate distinction of losing 2 sons to battle against the enemy. One in 1998 and one in 2004. And she gave me the 2010, excuse me, of her two sons. One was Uriel, who was killed in South Lebanon in 1998. One, Eliraz, who was killed in 2010. So I carry these with me in my wallet all the time. In my office, where you don't see, where I can see from my desk, I have a picture of me standing at one of these grave sites. The picture, the grave site, is of a fellow I did basic training with. I know you can't see him, I just want to make a point. He's behind here. He was a red-headed Canadian who volunteered. His name was Yoshua Friedberg, and he was kidnapped by Hamas terrorists in 2003. And one of the first victims, they tortured him for a while, and then they shot him at close range, and they dumped his body not far from Mitzpeh Yericho. So I go to his kever as often as I can. We together were through basic training. We actually ran the minyan, the two of us. And so I think of Yoshua Friedberg, who was, at that time, a soldier from Chutz La'aretz, and they was afraid they wouldn't have a minyan, and 20,000 people showed up to the Levaya. He's buried in Har Herzl. And I think about these people. Then I've been to Har Herzl pretty much every summer since 1982. I've been there. The first time I went to Har Herzl, though, was 1975. And it was for a guy from Gush who was killed in a terrorist attack in a very bizarre set of circumstances. He took the same exact trip that I took a month before, slept in the exact same room in Ramat Makshimim, which is 1,000 meters from the Syrian border, and the only terrorist attack in history that ever took place in the Golan Heights happened to him and his group, sleeping in the same room that we were sleeping in. Terrorists came in, they mamish came with axes, and they beheaded them. I had never gone to a military funeral before. This is a guy I knew. He wasn't my buddy, but we were friends. I saw him at the Beit Midrash. Thursday nights we played ball in Rosh Tzurim. So I got to go to my first military levaya, and I'm altogether 18. And there were thousands of people there. There was the father, and Rav Goren was the chief rabbi at the time. And I guess out of a morbid sense of curiosity, I pushed my way all the way to the front, till I mamish came to the rim of the kever. And I was there as they lowered the casket with the flag, and I learned then that halachically, well, he was not killed in uniform, but they told me afterwards, when a soldier is killed in uniform, you don't do any tahara, they are buried with their uniforms. Yeah. That's the psak of all the rabbanut, and all the rabbanim. So I'm there seeing this fellow who was altogether 2 years older than me lowered into the ground, and I happened to be next to his father. And for the first time in my life, I watched a father say Kaddish for his son. It took the father 20 minutes. And there wasn't a dry eye among thousands of us watching this man say Kaddish for his son. And then after that event, my chavrusa, who was Israeli, I remember Yair Paz, took me for a walk through the Yom Kippur War section, which is, remember, this was 2 years after the Yom Kippur War. And I think that day changed my life. I spent 2-3 hours in Har Herzl just going up and down the rows. I was just 18, and I was just going through all the different tombstones of soldiers who died in the Yom Kippur War, which was a war. 3,000 soldiers died in 3 weeks of fighting. 19, 20, 19, 20, 21, 19, 20, and I was horrified. And a lot of things changed for me that day. But what became worse for me is when I started to come back as a father. And the older I am, the more terrible it is for me to go to Har Herzl. Unfortunately, I know more and more stories and more of the people who were buried there. Many of them were sons of friends. Many of them were acquaintances, and unfortunately the list gets longer. And now I have a completely different view when I show up there. When I was 18, I looked at every tombstone like a normal 18-year-old, and I go, there for the grace of God go I. That could be me. That's what you think about. Then when I hit my 20s and 30s and 40s and now 50s, I don't last very long at Harvard's. I look at each one of these kevers as a child. A child. He could be 25, he could be 20, he's a child. He's somebody's son. And it's devastating. I remember the first time I went to Michael Levin's kever was the American who was killed in 2006. And his parents had left his Little League baseball hat on his kever. I started to talk, and then I couldn't stop crying. I just was picturing little Michael Levin playing ball in Philadelphia in Little League, and his parents imagining the pain that they had, and here he is, Kavur and Har Herzl. And then the worst thing is there's already a whole section, I know, at least 10, 12 people who are buried there. Obviously all considerably younger than me. And you walk, and I'm there with a group, and there's one row I walk down, Roy Klein is number one, then 2 spots later after him, is if you go to Efrat, the man who runs the pizza store, it's his son, and then after that, there's this guy Erez, who I met his family there. It's so painful, it's so difficult. I once had a security guard with me who worked on one of my tours. He was 26, he looked to me like I was 21. We talked, we schmoozed. I found out he was in Sayeret Golani, which is a recon commando unit. Very quiet, soft-spoken guy. Didn't say a word most of the tour. We get to Har Herzl, he hears me talk, he sees me crying, he walks over to me, do you mind if I say a few words to the kids? I said, sure, b'chabod. Then this very quiet, shy, 26-year-old guy begins to talk. In the one section that we were standing, he had 13 friends buried. Between all his military service. I got smarmored. I got a shock when he said that. I couldn't believe it. As a 26-year-old guy with 13 friends buried in Har Herzl. I was in a little bit of shock. Ad kedei kach. And he was rather calm about it. And he was explaining it at each kever. This is how it happened to him. And over here, this happened. We were in Gaza together. And I remember for a split second, the terrorist came and shot him. And then I turned around and I killed the terrorist. It was like surreal. It was really surreal. In the war in Lebanon in 2006, I was doing my reserves in the Gush Etzion area. And I was schizophrenic for most of my miluim. My job is, I was working at checkpoints, and we dealt not with civilians so much as Palestinian workers every day, males, so there was more concern, body checks, scans, running cards, going through metal detectors. My job was to protect the soldiers who were searching them. I was their cover. So for about 3 hours every morning, and then 3 hours in the afternoon, that was my job. It's a job where you stand behind a little embankment. You have to look the part. You don't talk. You don't have contact with anybody. You're just there to cover the guys as they pat them down. They go, because God forbid something goes wrong, I'm the backstop. So you have this switch in your head that you act like a tough guy, and you really feel that way, and those 2-3 guys are depending on you. And then the minute my shift was over, I would go into my car, put on the radio, and start listening to which funerals were going to be that day. And in Israel, it's a small country, so they give all the details of the young man and where he was killed. And in some cases, the mother requested, could you please play this song, the Zecher Nishmas, my son? And I would sit in my car and I would cry. And this was going back and forth for days. I would, 3 hours tough as nails, and 3 hours crying like a little girl. This was going on the whole time. I'm going to tell you what my friends are doing today, then kind of end with another small story, and then what we're doing the rest of the day. All my friends are officers. And if they're my age or close to my age, they're already high-ranking officers. They're battalion commanders, they're brigade commanders. They've been in and around the army anywhere between 25 to 35 years. What they do on Yom HaZikaron is they start their morning in their cars and they go to visit the families of every single soldier that died under their command. And I know all these people in their regular lives. And they have children and they're loving parents and they're good people and balei chesed. But you don't realize till Yom HaZikaron that they're carrying the deaths of all of these men on their shoulders. It never leaves them. Every single soldier who died under their command is a personal achrayus on them. And whether they died 20 years ago, or Chalila V'chas, Rahman al-Islam, they died a year ago. They spend the whole day, from morning till night, visiting every family. The family could be in Beersheba, and the last family could be up in Ramat HaGolan. And there's no question, there's no shaila, that's what they do. They go from family to family to family to family, just to be machazek them, to tell them, we remind you, I remember your son. Some of these sons now would be in their 40s. Some of them would be 25, 26. And that's what they're doing all day today. It's not over. It's now 9:30, so it means it's like 4:30. They're in the middle of they're towards the end of their rounds, driving from family to family, house to house, in the sense to be not just menachem avel, but to be mechazek these people. The whole country has somebody buried in a military cemetery. The whole country. A father, a brother, a cousin, an uncle, a grandfather, a close friend, a neighbor's son. There's not a family that's not visiting some military cemetery today. The siren goes off in Israel on Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaShoah. And if you've ever seen it on a videotape, the whole country comes to a stop. The closest thing I could give you as a sense is what we just learned in the Parsha. Vayidom Aaron. After his two sons were killed, the Torah doesn't have any, it's like the only time this word is used is Vayidom Aaron. You're speechless. There's nothing to say. The whole country is Vayidom. Nobody knows what to, even the most, unruly Israeli. Everybody's stopping their cars. Everybody's quiet. Some people are thinking. Some people are saying Tehillim. But the whole country in unison freezes. And the whole day on the radio is only sad songs. All of Israeli radio stations. They're interviewing mothers and fathers and brothers and officers. And all there are starting last night is stories from the 48 war, from the 56, from 67, from guys who were killed this past year, from Tzuk Eitan. That's the whole day. Radio, television, internet. That's what the whole country's going through. Everybody is focused on this. I want to end with two thoughts to give perspective, and then tie on the rest of the day. There was a terrible case in the Six-Day War, because the Six-Day War was the first time the generation of Holocaust survivors lost their sons in battle. In 1948, it was the survivors themselves who were killed. In 56, it was the survivors themselves who were killed. By 67, you already had the first generation of children of Holocaust survivors. So what does a Rav from the army do when you knock on the door of a father who went to the Shoah? You have to tell him their son was killed in war. So the Rav that they sent, I don't remember his name, himself was a Holocaust survivor. That was the only person who the army felt, and the Rabbanut felt, was capable walking over to this man, holding his hand and telling him the gzeira. And this is what he said. I can repeat this because I'm saying something he said. I don't have the zchut myself to say such a thing. I want that to be clear. I don't have the zchut to think it, and I don't have the zchut to say it. But I have the zchut to repeat it. Father comes to him, the Rav comes to him and says, you remember what it was like when we were in the lagers together. He said, what would you have given in 1943 if someone would come to you when you were in Auschwitz and said to you that in 24 years you're going to have a son in the army of the sovereign Jewish state fighting to defend the Jewish people? What would you have said if someone told you that in 1943? So the father said, I couldn't imagine or believe that such a reality could ever take place. So the Rav looked back, the Rav from the army said, please remember that, because your son was killed today in one of the battles in the 67 war. And I know people like you and me, 20-something years ago, in our wildest dreams, we never believed we would be anywhere but ashes or burnt or gassed or shot. And here we are, both living in our own country. Rahman al-Islam, you had a son sacrificed to protect us all. When Auschwitz was working in full capacity, which was towards the end, the Nazis had an inverse relationship to killing Jews. The more they lost on the battlefield, the more Jews they killed. At least let us get that done. There were days in Auschwitz in the beginning of 1945 that 24,000 people were killed a day. The number in Israel today is, I forget the exact number, of soldiers and terrorists. Soldiers is 23,000. I forget the exact number. And terrorist victims is about 2,700. The way we keep this in perspective is that all this sacrifice has led to almost 70 years of sovereignty. 3 million Jews making Aliyah. Kibbutz Galuyot, V'shavu Banim L'Gvulah. Israel has become the Torah center of the Jewish world. There is no one who will debate that. It is the safest place for a Jew to be a Jew, from either those who don't believe in the Medina to those who are the most secular. They are comfortable being Jewish in Medinat Israel. I remember I was in Pesach, I was in Israel, and when I was driving on Highway 6 on Chol HaMoed to take a trip up north, I can't tell you how happy and special it was. Every electronic sign that I passed on the highway said, Moadim L'Simcha, Moadim L'Simcha, Moadim L'Simcha, and I'm driving on the road for 150 kilometers. And then I was hiking with my family in Nachal Alal, thousands of Jews, everybody saying, Chag Sameach, Moadim L'Simcha, with kippot, without kippot. Last story, then I'll tell you about the schedule. This is one of my many visits to Har Herzl. And what happens is I speak to the group, and towards the end of speaking to the group, I break down. And then I sit on the side. I need about 10 minutes to collect myself. It takes me a long time. A mother walks by. This story is about from 20 years ago. A mother walks by me with like a 10 or 12-year-old child. They see me sitting on the side, and I'm sobbing uncontrollably. It's the one place I just can't help it, because it's Eov. This is not a normal cemetery. It's the old coming to bury the young. It's not the way it should be. So she sees me crying there, and she walks over to me, and she goes, "My husband wouldn't want you to cry so much." And I'm looking up, and I realize she's a widow. And she's coming to visit her husband's kever that was 6-7 feet away from me. she points to her husband's kever and she says to me, she mentioned his name, which I don't remember. She said, he died so we can live in this country. So she says, I want you to stand up, and I want you to look around. And I want you to see all of Yerushalayim. Then I want you to imagine all of Israel. That's what my husband died for. So don't be so sad. Be sad, but also remember why he sacrificed. I don't know where she got the otzma from to say that to me, and how she looks at the world that way, but I became almost embarrassed. Who am I to sit and cry there if this woman's telling me her husband? And the fact is, I cleared up right away, and I said todah to her in a sheepish voice. And that story remains with me for 20 years. What you see here, there are 23,000 plus kvarim all over Israel that look just like this today. Every military cemetery has soldiers standing by every kever. Little Israeli flags are put on each one. And people, families from all over the country go to the military cemetery where their sons, husbands, cousins, brothers, grandparents are buried. And as Rabbi Freeman mentioned, sometimes there's a kever achim. That's really from Gush Etzion, where we don't know which part belongs to whom. So everybody's buried together in a large mound, and all the matzevos are lined up on the mound, and you don't know who's who, but it's called kever achim. So after you go up to Shir, in the TV in front of the shul, in front of the office, we're going to have a loop of 2 sad songs that show you military funerals and soldiers fighting and give you a sense of what the mindset is in Israel. I'll bring this upstairs also to the front, so that'll help. And then we're coming back down here, 4th period, to see a movie of a modern day tzaddik, a hero, Ro'i Klein. Ro'i Klein, we already heard 2 stories about him this year from 2 people from Israel who came. Yoni Shepton spoke about him, and who's his name, the chief of the army? Rav Aransky spoke about him. Ro'i Klein was a guy who came from Eli, from the Mechina, who had just finished almost going through all of Shas, 2 children, a man who believed in Eretz Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, Am Yisrael, and with all his heart and might, you'll see. And he, in a battle, in a place called Bin Shebel in South Lebanon, a grenade was thrown in to the room they were fighting in. He mamash jumped on the grenade and said Kriyat Shema. This is not an agadah, it's not a story, kachaya. And we're going to see the story, the movie of Ro'i Klein. I had the zchut to be at the Haskara, the second Haskara in 2008. I was invited by a friend of mine who was a friend of his, and I listened to his widow speak in person and his friends, and I was overwhelmed, and I really felt I'm not shaykh, I'm not worthy of being in this place. But you'll understand the type of kibburim that we have today. And hopefully all of these things together will give you a sense of what Yom HaZikaron is, and then we ricochet tomorrow emotionally, and we go to Yom HaTzmaut. So I just ask you all to think about what Rabbi Freeman said, what I said, and be a little bit koved rosh today. And when you have a chance not to run out of shir, but those if you're out throughout the day, lunch, etc., you'll see the 2 videos, and we'll be back here at 11:15 to see the movie of Ro'i Klein.